This is the Observations Podcast for Sunday, the 20... What is it? What date is it now? It was literally just up on top of the screen. It's it's February 18th. That's right, February 18th, 2024. Hi, welcome back to the podcast. I'm Dale Franks.
I'm Michael Wade.
And I wanted to get started this week. It's been 2 weeks. Various sporting events and personal issues have prevented us from being here on the podcast for 2 weeks. So there's a lot that has happened. I want to go back a couple of weeks because I do want to start off with something that I've seen some people commenting about, and a lot of the commentary, it seems to me, has missed some of the points. But I actually did want to go back to this Tucker Carlson interview with Vladimir Putin, which I did listen to.
I'll fess up that I have not watched any of it. I have no idea what they talked about. I have no idea what came out of it. Oh,
okay. Well, let me do some coverage here of what was talked about. Actually, even before we get into the coverage of what was talked about, I think there's a very interesting question. Michael will be back in a second, by the way. But there's a very interesting question to discuss. A lot of people, after Tucker Carlson interviewed him, said there were a lot of softball questions. The only real sort of moderately hardball question that Tucker asked was at the very end when he asked him about an American journalist who's being held in Russia for spying. And he pressed Putin to let him go. Other than that, the questions were pretty much straightforward. Like the very first question, why did you invade Ukraine? Why? I think my first question is, if you're going to interview Vladimir Putin, so we can take it completely out of the context of what Tucker might or might not have done. If you're going to interview Vladimir Putin, what tack do you take? I mean, as a journalist, and I realize this is a very subjective question, but what tack do you take? Do you ask him fairly straightforward and neutral questions and just elicit whatever his responses are? Should your point be to allow him just to talk so that we can see what his arguments are and what he is thinking? Or is it your job to challenge him at every turn where you disagree and make it a much more confrontational issue? Keeping in mind that this is a guy for whom journalists who are insufficiently supportive somehow end up jumping out of 17th floor hotel rooms. You're a foreigner. We're going to pretend that you have some level of protection from just being outright tossed out of your hotel room by FSB thugs. But what tack do you take? Do you just ask him neutral questions and let him talk? Or do you try to be confrontational? I'm not sure I know the answer to that question. I'm not sure how you handle that interview.
Well, I think I assume that anybody like a Putin, Khomeini, anybody like that who, or Xi in China, is going to have some guidance as to what you can cover and what you can't cover. So, and maybe the tone of questions. So, I mean, I think you do have to kind of walk on eggshells a little bit. But
by the way, I'm not sure there were any of those kind of preconditions for this interview.
I'm not sure either. I just assume that
Vladimir Putin a couple of days ago actually came out and said he was rather disappointed by the interview because he thought there were too many softball questions. Now, you can believe as much of that as you like, but Vladimir Putin has said, I expected to be challenged more.
Well, I don't think that you need to challenge him as so much elicit what he says and then compare it to what he does. And I think that's pretty powerful in and of itself. You're not going to change his mind. And you're not going to affect really anything. But what you can do is hold him up to, the daylight with what he says versus what he does. I mean, that would be my approach anyway. I don't know how Tucker approached it.
All right. Well, Tucker was pretty much straight down the middle, just asking questions, eliciting basically Putin's views. And the first question, Putin answered in an interesting way. And by the way, many of the things I'm about to say are going to piss off some of you. And a few minutes later, you're going to be happy. And then you're going to be pissed off again. And then you're going to be happy again. Because I think we have to take a much more nuanced look at this and Russia in general. And by the way, I have some of my own thoughts about how I regard Russia that I'm actively considering. But the first question he asked was, why did you invade Ukraine? And almost amusingly, Putin says, well, I got to give you some background. Give me about a minute. And then he took about 25 minutes, starting off with, back in 874, the Duke of Moscow. You know, it's like, can you explain how World War II began? Well,
Yeah, right.
you must start in 405 with the arrival of Hengist and Horsa, the Saxon warlords on the shores of Anglia. He went through this entire historical justification for why Ukraine is part of Russia. And it's clear that his position is that, well, they called it Kievan Rus for a reason, which was actually Ukraine ran what was then Eastern Russia. Somehow that got flipped, which is fine. And I didn't find much in Vladimir Putin's recitation of the last 1,100 years of Russian history over 25 minutes to disagree with. I did find some, and some where I just know he's being intentionally disingenuous. But he set up basically a historical reason for why, if we start back in 874, which is really where he started, why Ukraine is actually part of Russia. They are not a separate people, and they shouldn't be. Which, okay, fair enough. Let's assume that everything he said about that history was true. The question then becomes, so what? We can't adjudicate modern geopolitical issues based on who held power 1,100 years ago. I mean, where does that stop? That doesn't seem to be a useful way of looking at international relations in any way. I mean, how far? First of all, we don't even have to go back to 874. Let's just go back to 1917. Do we rebuild the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire? Because, I mean, up until 1918, they had run, the Austro-Hungarian Empire had largely run Central Europe for 800 years or so. The Ottoman Empire had run the Middle East since the 700-ishes or so, the 8th century. So is 1918 a good dividing line? Can we make political decisions today based on who was running Europe in 1918? And again, how far back do we go? Do we have to give Calais back to Britain? That's not... Look, I mean, it might explain your thinking about why you think you're authorized to invade another country, but it doesn't serve as a basis. That historical stuff just doesn't serve as a basis for any sort of geopolitical reckoning today, does it?
Well, it's not a well-reasoned justification, I think, is what it boils down to.
Who cares who ran the place 150 years ago? We have to live in the world, the geopolitical world that we've inherited now. And we might not like that world, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't change it. So I think that is a Russian justification, but it's not a very good justification. By the way, if you want to compare and contrast, then why didn't Russia let Chechnya just break apart from Russia 15 years ago? I mean, clearly there are major... You talk about people who aren't Russians. They're clearly not Russians.
Right.
So, who says that Russia gets to run Chechnya when they don't really have historic ties with Russia? I mean, other than being conquered by the I'm not even sure they were conquered by the Tsars. That might have been a Soviet deal.
Yeah, it was Soviets.
So, I mean, it didn't make a lot of sense that that thing. And then the other thing he said, for unknown reasons, Lenin and Stalin created the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic separate from Russia. That kind of floored me. There are no unknown reasons. We know exactly why the four republics were created. And it was a blatant bit of political brinksmanship by the Russians to basically have four different possible members of the League of Nations, four different, and by the way, they were treated as separate countries in World War II in what was called then the United Nations. Not what we know of as the United Nations today, but what they called the Allies in World War II. Yeah, I mean, there were lots of reasons. It's not like unknown. So that was kind of weird. However, then Putin starts saying stuff that is just absolutely true, which is he went back to the 1990s and the discussions that the Bush administration was having with Yeltsin, and even the Clinton administration were having with Yeltsin. And the Russians were told, and I remember this, by the way, this is not, beyond my lifetime. I remember being told, we will not extend NATO to the east.
Right.
We understand that, first of all, everybody, I think, should understand that the Russians, geopolitically, are probably the most paranoid people in the world.
Yeah.
Every country that's managed to field a halfway decent army, including Sweden, has invaded and conquered portions of Russia. And by the way, the United States invaded Russia. Not many people know this. The United States, Great Britain, and France invaded the Soviet Union in 1917. And we took the Karelian Peninsula and occupied parts of Russia. So the Russians are pretty paranoid. And they were told, we will not extend NATO to the east. And yet, during the 2000s, that's exactly what we did. The price for, okay, we're still bearing the wounds of the Great Patriotic War, as they call World War II. But, okay, we'll allow German reunification. We're not happy about it because the Germans have historically been a problem, but we're going to allow it. On the other hand, even though the Warsaw Pact has fallen apart, let's leave a buffer zone there. And basically, he was told, sure, we will do that. Brent Scowcroft told him that, who was the National Security Advisor. Secretary of State told him that. Presumably, President Bush told him that, as did President Clinton. So why did we... So you talk about Russia having a valid historical claim. That's one of them. Because we told them we're not going to do X, and within a decade we decided to do X, and basically looked at them and said, what are you going to do about it?
Well, and we've been pushing for Ukraine to join NATO, which I think is dumb, but whatever. I
just don't understand why we would do it. We know who the Russians are. They are who they've been for hundreds of years. Look, you can make the argument, many on the right do. Depending on the part of the right you're talking about, is that, look, Ukraine are an independent country, and if they decide that they want to look to the West and join part of NATO, then they, as an independent country, are perfectly okay. They're perfectly free to do that. Is that true? Is it worth what the Russians will inevitably take as a provocation?
Well, to whom?
Well, to the Russians. Because the Russians are just going to go batshit crazy, seeing NATO butted up right against their border. And by the way, here's a bigger question. Once the Soviet Union fell, what was the purpose of NATO?
Well, a lot of people question that. I mean, Russia still is an expansionist threat, but we're clearly finding out not as much of a threat as we thought. Yeah, you're right. I mean, the whole point of NATO was to retard Soviet aggression. And once it fell, certainly for a while there wasn't much for NATO to do. It's questionable as to whether NATO is even necessary, especially when it's really us. Europe doesn't do enough to protect itself. It doesn't. It certainly doesn't arm and train and equip anywhere close to what we do. Germany, I don't think, has a functional tank battalion.
Well, I think that what the Russians probably might have thought was that once the Warsaw Pact fell apart and then the Soviet Union dissolved, and so, much of what was in the old Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Ukraine, Belarus, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, they all became separate countries.
Yep.
I'm sure that there was, at least on some level, some expectation that NATO would just dissolve. The entire reason for NATO's existence had just disappeared. Maybe that would have been a good time to say, once the Warsaw Pact fell apart, well, what do we need NATO for? If the Europeans want to have some European defense things in the absence of the Soviet Union, let them build one. And sure, the United States will be there as a backstop, but maybe we don't need to be formally part of that alliance.
There's certainly people on the right who think that.
Yeah, and look, it's I spent my 10 years on active duty in the military at the height of the Cold War and just at the very end of the Soviet Union. So I am automatically predisposed to dislike and distrust Russia anyway. And yet I have to think, look, is this the same? Does Russia provide, outside of nuclear weapons, which are always an existential threat, but just in terms of their policy, is Russia anywhere near the existential threat that the Soviet Union was? And I think the answer has to be no. You don't have this.
Yeah, I agree with you on that.
Massive amount of Russian clients in the Middle East and in South and Central America and in Africa. Those ties were all broken when the Soviet Union fell apart. Russia largely stands alone. It's a country in demographic decline. We've talked about demographic decline in China. Whew, take a look at Russia's population pyramid.
Yeah.
It's a disaster. The Russian population has declined from like 200 million down to about 160 million people, and will probably decline to 80 or 90 million people over the next 30 to 50 years. What are we worried about with the Russians? Now, none of this is to say that Russia should have invaded Ukraine. There is, I think, a general principle that independent countries should have some relative freedom from just being invaded by aggressive neighbors. But then again, you talk about Ukraine and Russia. It's not like either of those two countries are beacons of freedom and democracy and liberal.
And that's where a lot of people have problem with constantly propping up the Ukraine to the tune of over $100 billion. And we don't know how it was spent. And we don't have any clue as to why we're going to spend another
here's
60 billion, whatever it is.
Here's a problem. We do know how a lot of it was spent. It was sent directly into the pockets of U.S. defense contractors to provide.
They said that on the dais. Well, it's no big deal, because 95% of that money is going right back to us to build the weapons. It's all good.
Yeah, that we're just going to ship over to Ukraine, and who cares if they sell them in Central Africa or Western Africa or Southeast Asia? And once they have the shells or the ammunition or whatever, we don't care. At least we got the money to Raytheon and General Dynamics and whoever, which makes you wonder.
That's what it starts to look like, right? That really is what it looks like, is a propping up of the military-industrial complex.
Yeah, is this some principled defense of Ukraine, or is this a way just to keep money flowing to the defense-industrial complex? This starts to get real complex real quick when you start asking questions. And the easiest way to keep people from answering questions is to say, well, this is vital to America's defense, which is what they're saying in Congress right now. Don't you understand how vital this is to America's defense to defend Ukraine from Russia?
No, I really don't.
Yeah, appreciated. I dislike and distrust Russia, appreciated they shouldn't be invading Ukraine, or well, they don't have to invade Belarusia because they have a puppet there, just like they used to have in Ukraine. Ukraine wasn't a problem when it was run by their puppet. It's only a problem when it's run by a pro-Western-ish government. That just seems like to go back to, what is it, the Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, the old,
don't throw me in the briar patch.
Yeah, well, there's the Tar Baby story where, you touch it and it just gets stuck to you and you can't get it off. And it just, I don't know. It just makes me wonder why we're doing what we're doing. And by the way, I can't believe the justifications that are coming out of it. And the thing that irks me even more whenever they talk about Ukraine is how they have taken and hooked up Ukraine with fixing the U.S. border. And now we're looking at Tuesday, some sort of bipartisan plan that will both send $90 billion to Ukraine and will also, quote unquote, fix the border. And if you believe that they have interest in fixing the border, well, but those things are not related. Why are they related in legislation? This kind of stuff really makes me question a government that, largely I don't much trust anymore.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, it's pretty clear why the White House and Democrats want this, because they've clearly got some palms to grease, and this is the way that they do it. And they don't want to enforce the border. So even the bill that they proposed, after the House had already passed a border bill years ago, a couple years ago, and it languished, nothing happened with it. So then we get this border bill that's bipartisan because 2 Republicans joined it, and it doesn't do anything to solve the crisis at the border. The Democrats' idea of solving the crisis is to just make it easier to legalize everybody, and then we don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, I mean, if the
whole problem is we're slapping this illegal label on them, and if we don't do that, then they're just citizens, and everything's cool.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's like it's a PR problem.
Right.
You're thinking of it as illegal immigration. If it was legal immigration, it would be good. So we'll just make it legal.
Right.
Problem solved.
That's essentially what the White House has been doing.
And I can't think of any principled reason, and I know that libertarians out there will hate this, but I can't think of, the programmatic libertarians. I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't secure the border. I can't think of any reason why you wouldn't want to make it harder to get into the country illegally. Whatever you do with legal immigration, that's a completely separate subject. The idea of border security goes far beyond immigration. It gets us into national security and terrorism and a variety of foreign threats. Why are there so many Chinese people who are coming across the border?
That is a real question.
I saw people, these people that go to the border and they just show things. And one of the things somebody showed was a pack of Marlboros from the nation of Georgia with their weird squiggly writing on. Wait a second. You bought a pack of Marlboros in Georgia and you're now inside the United States? Either you're not a very heavy smoker, or that's a pretty efficient pipeline from getting you from Georgia in through Texas or California or wherever it was. There are serious issues here, and they refuse to address them. And the weird thing is, Biden came out, a week ago, and he said, if you would just give me the legal authority, I'd close that border right now.
Then fucking do it. You've already got the legal authority. Just do it. Why should we give you more laws if you don't even enforce the ones that are already there?
Well, that's the thing. There is a couple of different laws. We've talked about them before. But one of which just basically gives the president carte blanche authority to say, there's an emergency at the border. I will completely close all border crossings. The president technically could declare an emergency and close all the border, all that he wanted. By the way, President Trump did that. Why is there a crisis at the border now? Because Biden spent the first 90 days overturning all of Trump's executive orders to close down. He did it mostly on day one. Yeah, mostly on day one. And he killed the Remain in Mexico policy and all of that other stuff. And now he says he needs legal authority to do it. Weird, because Trump had the legal authority to do it, and people were trying to take him to court to stop him from doing it, and he still was able to do it. So they clearly don't want to close the border. And so then you have to ask why. And, you know, they say that the great replacement theory is a huge conspiracy theory.
Right. The one they came up with?
Yeah, the one that John Judas and Rui Teixeira wrote a book about in 2004.
Right.
Explaining precisely how it would work. That weird conspiracy theory, by the way, both of them.
It's the Democratic stupid.
Democratic strategist. It's not a conspiracy theory. And wow, see, the trouble with talking about any one thing is that when you pick at a thread, it leads you to another thing. You know, so is the great replacement theory a big conspiracy theory? You know, like the lab leak theory was?
Yeah, right.
It's funny how many things that are inconvenient for the government suddenly become conspiracy theories.
Oh, yeah, every time. And this has been a rather new development, or at least a new tact by government in the last 10 years where, no, that is absolutely, they've just got more blatant in their lying about it. And, no, that's a conspiracy theory because this is what we're doing, not that at all.
Yeah, well, not just that they're lying about it. I expect the government to lie quite a lot. The government has lied a lot during my lifetime. I think the really scary thing is having people who are, which I guess they're enjoined from doing now by the federal courts, but you know, for 5 or 6 years, including during the Trump administration, they were going after social media and forcing them, well, not forcing, but advising them that, hey, maybe these posts need to be taken down. And if you don't, well, you know, be a shame if somebody had to come in here and regulate all this, huh?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that case is still going on.
Yeah, but at least they've been enjoined from doing that. The federal courts have said, no, you can't contact any social media company for any reason at all for telling them not to allow people to say stuff on their on social media. But that's fine. They don't have to anymore because at least companies like Facebook have gotten the message.
Yeah.
You know, on Facebook, if you want to talk about anything other than cute puppies and fluffy kitties, well, you're taking your account's life into your own hands. Because everybody knows what is supposed to be said and what isn't.
Yeah. Which, I that's why I think that Missouri case is a slam dunk. I mean, it was so obvious that the tech companies picked up on it. They were quite aware that they were being threatened. And actually, a lot of them were pretty willing, happy, and able to do the government's bidding.
Yeah, sure, because it fell right
Which is what led Elon Musk to take over Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much he regrets having done that at this point, but the fact is he did, and it's become a far more free speech platform. In fact, I've certainly noticed certain people, how their reach has started to increase, where for years that you just barely even saw them. So there was clearly something going on behind the scenes there that has been not completely, but I think largely cleared out at Twitter. But, you know, try doing, well, assuming anybody's on Threads to listen to you, try doing that on Threads or Facebook or Instagram. They'll just shut that crap down real quick. So there's still a fair amount of censorship that's going on there, even though the government currently is not allowed to do it. And again, I don't see how the government wins that case. I don't see how they can justify on First Amendment grounds, yeah, we get to go and tell social media companies what they should and shouldn't allow on their platform.
Well, I love that they try to tie it to a national security issue, is what gives them carte blanche.
Yeah,
It's like,
of course.
it's words, man. It's
Yeah.
just words.
Yeah, it's all national security. Every time the government needs to justify anything, it's national security. It's almost as if Dwight David Eisenhower never even gave his final address. Which is a weird thing. He warned us in 1960. Hey, the Defense Industrial Complex, which, by the way, we didn't even know what the name was until he gave it to him. The Defense Industrial Complex will take over. It's the national security state.
Mm-hmm.
And we've gotten so used to the national security state, and 9/11 didn't help in any way, shape, or form.
It worsened it in a lot of ways, yeah.
And the government just doesn't see any reason why they shouldn't impose any policy on us that they want. I was talking to my wife earlier today, and she was talking about, and this is in the UK, not in the US. She was talking about in the UK, they're starting to discuss about how bad pet ownership is for the environment. And that if you want to own a dog, you should probably be licensed and you should be charged very heavily, because owning a dog is like owning 3 SUVs or something like that. It's like there's no... And here in the United States, even though they haven't actually done anything other than asked for our cooperation, this idea that, hey, if you're growing a garden in your backyard and you got some carrots and some broccoli and some lettuce growing back there, maybe you should tell the federal government that you have that food back there. Maybe you should register your little garden. That way it'll, just help us to know where stuff is being grown, for reasons that might be important sometime. You should probably register your garden. Now that's happening here. Again, nobody is putting any force behind that now, but you got to ask, okay, why is the government wanting us to register our garden? Why does the Department of the Interior care? And I can't help but think of the quote from Milton Friedman back in 1993 or 1994, where he said, in 1945, there were 12 million people working in agriculture in the United States. There were 12 million farmers. And the Department of the Interior employed about 80,000 people. Today, there are 3 million Americans working in agriculture. Oh, I'm sorry, 12%. 12%. And today, there are 3% of Americans working in agriculture. And the Department of the Interior now employs 200,000 people.
The Interior or Ag?
Oh, I'm sorry, Department of Agriculture now employs 200,000 people. Well, wait a second. If we've gone from 12% of the population to 3%, why are there so many more? Well, how come there hasn't been the same sort of diminution because it's not only just percentages, it's the absolute number of farmers has dropped substantially.
Right.
But the number of government workers never seems to.
Well, I mean, most of those farms are owned by
Archer Daniels Midland.
Yeah, I was going to say ADM is the big giant in the room, and it's mostly industrial farms. The small farmers are pretty dispersed. They don't really affect the overall agricultural.
The small family farm barely exists.
Yeah. Yeah, most of that land has been, split up and sold off into lots and developed and whatever.
Yeah, I mean, nationwide, there may be 1.5 million individuals who are running a small farm or ranch.
Yeah.
Beyond that, it's all run by agribusiness.
Mm-hmm.
We're not getting our chickens from, some fella up in the hills who just happens to have a few chicken coops. They're largely coming to us from, Tyson and Butterball.
Mm-hmm. Purdue.
Which are basically either brands of or sub-brands of Tyson or Purdue. Mm-hmm. Or Archer Daniels Midland, because they, of course, have their own chicken ranches and their own beef ranches. And it's just, it's like everything the government touches just turns to shit. I mean, back when Ronald Reagan said the most frightening words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And that was kind of funny. And everybody thought it was kind of true because everybody thought the government was kind of incompetent and that they didn't really know what they were doing. Because let's face it, government service was set up largely so that the lower third of our high school class could have a career. At the end of the day, that was largely the point of the civil service. The people who don't have drive, the people who just want a nice, secure job with a decent retirement and one that will not put too many demands on them on a day-to-day basis, those are the kind of people that go into government. We see them every time we walk into the DMV. Now, this should scare you. You know all those people that you see at the DMV that cause your blood to boil anytime you need to get your driver's license renewed? Yeah, they're working at the Department of Defense and the CIA. Mm-hmm. It's the same group of people. And we all knew that, and we all just thought, yeah, Reagan is right. Having the government drop by is generally more of a harm than a hindrance. And you see that asshole government agent in Ghostbusters, right, in 1984, where he was the butt of the joke. And he didn't get it because he was from the government, and all he cared about was maintaining control.
Yeah, my authority.
Yeah, exactly. That has now been coupled with, oh, hey, we're the government. We can actually make you do shit.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, we have our own SWAT teams now. I mean, the Department of Agriculture's, what is it, the Department of Animal Welfare has a SWAT team.
Yeah.
What? Because everybody has a SWAT team. The IRS has a SWAT team now.
That's scary.
And so it seems to have more from, yeah, maybe we're not competent and maybe we don't know as good as you. And you are not listening to us the way you should. Hey, you know what? We can just make you.
And they don't have any real concern about, legal consequences down the road. Even if they are fully aware that it's probably unconstitutional, illegal in some way, they go ahead and do it and try to make the court cases go out as far as possible so then they can keep doing it.
Yeah, and by the way, we just saw the FBI do that with that private safe deposit box case.
Mm-hmm.
They had a warrant that said, look, you can take the stuff in the safe deposit boxes and you can look at them at the contents only insofar as to A, ensure that that's not, the proceeds of a crime, and that B, you're needing to inventory it so that it can be returned to the owners. And the FBI said, yeah, you know what, we're just going to take it all.
Mm-hmm.
And so now we've had this long couple of year court case of these people whose stuff was literally stolen by the FBI in violation of the federal warrant, which gave them specific powers. And the FBI just basically said, yeah, you want it back? Sue us. We'll see what happens in court. Now, happily, they've lost. But the fact is...
But there's no consequences.
Yeah, nobody's going to lose their job. Nobody's going to get quit. The federal court is just going to say, hey, give them back their stuff or give them back the equivalent in cash. And they'll do it and they'll shrug their shoulders and say, oh, better luck next time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the biggest issue, and that's what people see. I mean, the two-tier system. We have not held anybody accountable since Dollar Bill from Louisiana.
Yeah, well...
And even that took a while.
I'm glad you brought that up, because here is Special Counsel Robert K. Hur's report on Joe Biden.
Mm-hmm.
And here's the executive summary. I really only have to go to the second sentence. Our investigation uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. Okay, well, you've now basically given me everything I need to convict him under 18 U.S.C. 793, the unlawful retention and dissemination of classified information. It's part of the Espionage Act of 1917. Okay. However, we conclude that the evidence did not establish Mr. Biden's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Okay.
Which
he had the classified documents. He was not authorized to have the classified documents. And he did apparently show some of those documents to other people.
And he kept them unsecured.
What other evidence would establish that he did not willfully retain and not just retain, because retaining is a crime in and of itself, that he did not retain and disclose the classified? We know that he did. And by the way,
and they found that he willfully did it.
By the way, they spanned Mr. Biden's career in national public life. He had documents from when he was a senator.
Yep.
And so, therefore, he had
and
documents.
Again, no classification or declassification authority, not even as vice president.
Yeah, so, and they go through all of the documents that he had. But again, it goes back to when he was a senator, when he absolutely had no right to possess or retain any of these documents at all. He could view them in a SCIF in the Capitol, and that was it. How did he even get them? And by the way, he kept notebooks, private notebooks, where he just wrote down classified information in those notebooks. And we can go through this executive summary on and on. And yet, as it comes, and then the principles of federal prosecution, but it all comes back down to the fact that, he's an old man, and the interests of society don't require pressing charges on him. And besides, he'd present himself to the jury as just a, forgetful, well-meaning old fella who can't really be held accountable. I mean, he can certainly, he's not forgetful. He's not so forgetful, but that he can't be trusted with the nuclear codes. But he's just forgetful enough that he is immune from federal prosecution.
Well, and that raises the question: if he is, his state of mind, his state of wellness is of such a detriment that he cannot be held accountable in a court of law, then he's unaccountable as a president, and that's not how it's supposed to work. I mean, that raises some serious issues as to his ability to be president, whether 25th Amendment, although that's kind of weak sauce as far as forcing somebody out, but or whether it's through impeachment. I know that they are doing an inquiry now into impeaching him. Something needs to give. And if he were out of office, he should absolutely be tried for this stuff. Whether or not a jury decides that he's an elderly old man who's well-meaning and a little forgetful, that's for the jury to decide. That's not for the DOJ to decide. I mean, that's just a gratuitous way of saying, yeah, we're not going to prosecute. Now, obviously, the standard policy for DOJ is you don't prosecute a sitting president, and that's fine. But that doesn't mean that he should be held, in that state in perpetuity. I mean, he committed clear crimes. As a matter of fact, they're the same things that Trump is charged with. And Trump at least has the ability to draw on the Presidential Records Act for support in his claims. Doesn't make him right or wrong. It's just he at least has something to fall back on. Joe has none of that.
No, well, here's the thing, and I was looking for this video. I know I reposted it. And gosh darn, I now can't find it. But there was a video where he was talking the day after Robert Hur released his report about him being, not very mentally with it. And Joe Biden said, the first thing when I answered it, because I can't find the video, even though I posted it, but now I just can't find it. But he said, the first thing I thought was, how dare he ask me this question? Every day I carry around a crucifix that we got at Our Lady of
Anyway,
And back, and also these questions about that was that was his response to being told he can't remember stuff well. Okay, he can't remember where he got the crucifix that he wears every day in honor of his son Beau's death, who he has repeatedly said died in Iraq, by the way.
yeah.
Which, at this point he may believe. So even his defense was not a ringing endorsement of his own mental capacity. And yet, we now have and of course, the weird thing is that everybody from the administration has now been coming out and saying, well, he is not dumb and he's not forgetful. Why, he has these 20-year-old staffers who come in and he quizzes them with insightful questions every morning to the point that they leave in tears. He is just so ruthless in his pursuit of facts and knowledge, which, okay, so you're saying he should stand trial.
Mm-hmm. That's the only other thing that can happen. No, he should be on trial. Okay, we agree.
Yeah, okay, your terms are acceptable to me.
Right. Next. I mean, it's just, but they go out there. I mean, the professional White House deck chair rearrangers and hope that this is going to change anything. And it doesn't. People see right through this crap. And even reporters are starting to let the gloves come off, which that's kind of monumental.
Honestly, I'm surprised that Joe Biden has made it through this much of his first presidency. I will take us back to our very first podcast after the 2020 election, and Joe Biden was inaugurated. And my prediction then was he's going to serve 2 years and 1 day, and then they can get rid of him and put Kamala Harris in his place. They just have to ensure that she serves less than 2 years of his term. Well, that didn't happen. Joe really apparently wants to hold on to this job, and that's fine. But it's fine for him because he gets to say he was president. For the rest of us, that doesn't appear to be all that fine. He's not popular. The Democrats must know that he is showing increasing signs of mental incapacity simply due to his age, which, again, he's 83. He really shouldn't be president anyway. And whether Donald Trump, 2 years his junior, should really be president anyway is also an interesting question. But leaving that aside, for the Democrats, his poll numbers are awful. People overwhelmingly say he is too old to be president, although they do say that about Donald Trump as well, which, by the way, I think they're probably correct. They're more or less correct in both cases. I think electing people who are around 80 years old to the presidency is probably not a great idea. Having someone younger, we've generally been good at grabbing guys in their 50s as president. That seems to be the nice peak age. But okay, fine. But Joe Biden has clearly got problems that Donald Trump does not mentally. Yeah, Donald Trump forgets things and whatever because he's almost 80 years old himself. So Joe Biden is a problem for the Democrats because now when you look at some of the state polling, he's either even with or behind Donald Trump at the state level. Forget about national polling. National polling is always going to be skewed by California and New York anyway, because they're so overwhelmingly Democratic, especially California, where 2/3 of the electorate are Democrats. State polls are now looking pretty bad for Joe Biden. And so as much as people may or may not dislike Trump, do we take the chance that Biden can pull this out like he did in 2020 because, well, most of the electorate didn't really know him really much as anything other than a rather avuncular old man. And if you had that impression of Joe Biden, you were a political neophyte, but we'll leave that aside. So you get rid of him. How do you toss him out? If you pull the 25th Amendment, that's a super, super scary way of doing it. Because now, first of all, 25th Amendment isn't exactly clear about who exactly can toss the president out of office. But the one way that we do know that you can do it is for the vice president and a majority of the cabinet to tell Congress he's not capable of performing his functions. And
But then he can defeat that by simply saying, nope, I'm fine. And then he automatically goes back to being president.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then there's this alternate method of some congressional, the way that it's written, the language is really unclear as to whether it is possible for a congressional committee to strip the president of his presidency. I think, by the way, it would be constitutional because I think it would sort of be implied from Congress's inherent impeachment powers. So outside of impeachment, if the president was incapable of performing the duties of his office, we're not impeaching him for a high crime or misdemeanor, but we are removing him from the office. And then the president gets a 30-day clock to prove that he's not incapable, whatever that proof may be. That's just, there's no way that no matter how you do it, there's no way that's not going to be messy.
And because it was designed to specifically be when someone was actually incapacitated for at least a short while, and to have a steady transfer of duties. Yeah, it wasn't designed to oust a president.
Yeah, and the idea is that once you oust the president, it's probably because he's sick or something, right? Or he's in the hospital,
right?
Or what have you, and he can't respond at the moment. But the doctors will fix him all up. 15 days later, 2 weeks later, he comes out of the hospital and he goes, okay, well, I'm ready to resume my office now. And he gets to go back into the office. Nobody has ever thought of it as a way of saying, this guy is too old and senile to be president. We have to remove him permanently. And let's say, even if you do it, the one way that we know you can do it now tars the vice president permanently with overthrowing the president of the United States and taking their job. So if you use it for the purpose for which it was designed, which was largely Dwight Eisenhower had a heart attack, and how much can Dick Nixon really get away with when he's president? That may be something we want to take a look at in the future. To this use of the 25th Amendment, which according to the letter of the law would be the right way to do it, but it just seems politically like a nightmare to invoke the 25th Amendment against a president who will immediately say, no, I'm perfectly capable of, this is some sort of coup. You're trying to overthrow the election. Now what do we do?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, unless he does it willingly, there's really not absent impeachment.
Yeah.
And I guess the Democratic convention could toss him out somehow. They'd have to have a lot of, I read something spelling out the machinations they would have to go through at the convention, because if he's got the delegates, he's got the delegates, but there's some trigger to where the delegates can change their mind or something. I can't remember how it works.
There is the Democratic the Democratic Party has long had an interesting view of how much actual democracy they want at their conventions.
Yeah.
And so once the scam of the superdelegates got fully exposed, they had to back off on that. But they still have, technically, the convention can elect anybody they want. So technically, even though if you have the delegates, you can't force them to vote for your candidate. The delegates can just pick anybody they want for president.
But the problem is that the conference isn't until September. I think the first week of September.
Yeah, end of August, first week of September. So yeah,
it's kind of late in the game to be putting another name on the ballot, and you might not even be able to in some places because they start shipping out ballots.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, you got to remember that printing cycle takes months to get those things done. So, yeah, and if it's between, and by the way, if Biden does get reelected, the chances of him serving out that term have got to be fairly
super
minimal.
low. Yeah. Yeah. I take the money line on that.
I mean, because when he takes office, by the time he takes office, he will be 83. And,
Yeah. Well, yeah. By the time, yeah, January, you'd be 83. Yeah.
so he is a problem for the Democrats. I honestly, I think Trump is less of a problem for the Republicans. He's a known quantity. You know what you're getting with him. And, even
He's
though
going to be at about $500 million uh, light in the finance department, but
yeah, although now he's managed to install family members running the RNC, that should help lighten things up for him. But I mean, at least he's a known quantity, and he does not appear like Joe Biden does to be just a senile old man. I mean, he is still pretty quick on his feet.
oh yeah,
So whatever,
he's at a good fighting weight.
yeah. So whatever ballast he carries with him, the ballast of being unable to remember his son's death is not one of them. But you did bring up an interesting thing, which is the Trump being $500 million lighter. It's actually 355 million. That's what Judge Engeron
Well, don't
said.
forget about the 83 million to the weirdo fashion writer or whatever she is.
Oh,
E. Jean
yeah,
Carroll.
that's right, E. Jean Carroll, because that in a separate case, he's now liable for
83 or
sexual
something.
assault, right? Plus, in addition to the $355 million for the Trump organization and a ban from doing business in New York for 3 years, he and Donald Jr. are both ordered to pay $4 million personally within the next 30 days. I thought it was amusing that in the wake of this, just like today or yesterday, Donald Trump released a new line of golden Trump sneakers that were selling for thousands of dollars a pair and are now going for like $5,000 a pair in the secondary market.
Jesus.
So whether it's this or the NFCs that he has sold, he manages to limit his losses. I think the question that I have here, and by the way, Judge Engeron wrote this: their complete lack of contrition and remorse borders on pathological. Really?
Remorse for what?
Yeah,
I mean,
that's the
thing.
question.
Who's that money going to? Victims? There are no victims.
There are no victims. You know why there are no victims? Because every single one of those loans were paid off.
Yeah, with interest.
With interest. Nobody lost money on this.
And the banks still want to do business
and by
with
the way,
the Trump organization.
And by the way, during the trial, the banks themselves said, yeah, we got all of our money back. We didn't lose a penny on this. The loans were all repaid in full at the agreed on rate of interest. So again, and we talked about this whenever Letitia James first filed this. All right, who are the victims? Because even in the trial, the purported victims of Donald Trump inflating his personal wealth numbers, which is what he's accused of doing. That's the fraud. He said he had more money than he did for collateral. And the banks accepted that because apparently banks don't do their own due diligence. They just believe every freaking thing that you tell them without question, because who would ever lie to the bank? And somehow fraud occurred. I can only hope that the New York Court of Appeals looks at this and says, what are we doing here?
Well, especially since it was almost day one of the trial when Engeron said, okay, the issue of fraud is already established, so we're just going to have a trial on damages. Like, what?
Yeah, how did that get established prior to trial?
Right. It's just, I mean, it was just so clearly a politically motivated lawsuit, and using the powers of state government to handicap presidential candidate.
Yeah, well, in chat, someone is asking the question that I was just about to ask you. So, inebriated Plutarch, good timing on that. Clearly, Trump's lawyers are going to do two things in the next week, which is appeal this to the New York State Court of Appeals, and in conjunction with that, ask for an injunction to prevent this judgment from being enforced, right?
Right. Yes. And the injunction's that's common. It's almost automatic. As long as you file your appeal within a certain day, within a certain time, then enforcement of the judgment is delayed. So that's going to happen. I suppose the Court of Appeals could deny hearing. And then you've got a really tricky case. How do you get it before the Supreme Court of the United States or any appeals court?
I don't know you get it before.
Because I don't know what the federal issue would be unless you're going to argue you were deprived of due process under the 5th and 14th Amendment.
That seems to be the only hook you could hang your hat on in the federal court. I think the real question is, though, what are the chances that the Court of Appeals in Albany takes a rather dim view of some of the things that Judge Engeron did? I mean, because once you go to the Court of Appeals in New York, you're really looking at reversible error. One of which, by the way, you just mentioned, the judge comes out on day one of the trial and says, "Oh, we already know there's fraud here. We don't need to worry our pretty little heads about whether someone got defrauded. We just need to worry about how much this is going to cost you."
Yeah, essentially.
I mean,
and then the numbers that they came up with were just so ridiculous. Mar-a-Lago is only worth $18 million.
Look,
okay,
right to the immediate south of Mar-a-Lago. Now, granted, Mar-a-Lago is not a residential property, but it's a very large property. I mean, very large. And there is a property about 1/3 the size of Mar-a-Lago. Now, look, Mar-a-Lago hasn't been on the market, right? It hasn't been sold for years. But whenever you want to look at comps, one of the most recent comps is this plot of land. It's a weirdly large, long, rectangular plot of land, about 1/3 the size of Mar-a-Lago. And it went for like $171 million when it was sold in 2021 or 2022. So that would seem to make Mar-a-Lago at 3 times the size on beachfront, which is an income-producing property, by the way.
Right.
It's not a residential property. It is a beach club. It is an income-producing property. It's only worth $21 million?
That makes no sense at all.
It seems like an acre of beachfront property in Florida, or a couple of acres actually, probably would go more than $21 million.
Definitely.
I should think. But Judge just said, yeah, $21 million. That sounds real reasonable for me. I mean, Jeebus cripes. What would that size of property cost in Manhattan? If we were just ballparking that. What do you think an acre of Manhattan real estate costs?
Jesus.
So
I mean, you can't get a 1-bedroom apartment for less than like $1.5 million anymore.
Yeah. So
an actual acre of land, just land in the middle of New York City. Oh my God. It'd have to cost like $100 million.
Yeah, it would have to. Even if there was nothing on it, just the land. So, when you talk about possible reversible error, it seems like there's a lot of it. Like you said, the New York Court of Appeals, which is where you go after you lose in the Supreme Court. Boy, don't even get me started on that weird convention. So once you go to the Court of Appeals, I mean, technically they could just say, no, we're not going to look at it. But my understanding is that the Court of Appeals in Albany is not quite as crazy as some of the Manhattan courts are in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, it's still a New York court, but as a matter of fact, did Sotomayor sit on that court, or was she might have been in federal court. I think she was in federal court.
Yeah, I think she was I'm not sure, but I think she was a federal judge.
I think she was Second Circuit, yeah.
Yeah, but there are just a lot of decisions in this case that don't make sense. And look, Donald Trump always comes out and he says, look, this is all just election interference. All they're trying to do is interfere in the election. There's this. We haven't even talked about Fani Willis, who apparently is hiring her lovers to prosecute Donald Trump for whatever reason. We didn't even get into that. And the hearing that they had on the ethics hearing in the Trump trial there. Whether you like Donald Trump or not, it is really hard. I mean, look, let's say Donald Trump wasn't running for president in 2024. Let's say that he had declared, back in 2022 or whatever, I'm not going to be a candidate in 2023. I think it's not unreasonable to ask ourselves the question, if he was not running for president, would any of these cases have moved forward?
Yeah, and I think it'd be a real reasonable answer to say, of course not. I mean, there does not seem to be any point to this. In fact, why didn't they bring the Letitia Jackson or Letitia James cases that were just decided? Why didn't they bring those back when it was happening? I mean, this is from old stuff. It wasn't from, a couple years ago.
Yeah,
so
this is from before he was president.
Yeah. Why didn't they bring it back then? Well, you know why?
Yeah, I mean,
because it wasn't an actual case to begin with. And what everybody would have been like, why? It's kind of like we are now.
And by the way, why would Letitia James run for election using as part of her program, I will go after Donald Trump. Elect me and I'll take down Donald Trump. Why? I mean, is what he did in the, early 2000s, mid 2000s, is that so egregious that you would have done that if you didn't think he was running for president in 2024? And I find it hard to believe the answer is yes. And so, the trouble with Donald Trump is that he is the boy who cried wolf, right? Everything is some attack on him personally, no matter what it is or where it is or what. And so whenever there are attacks that look like they are attacks on him personally, once everything else is an attack, people start saying, well, really? Is this too? Or did you actually do something wrong? And
right.
But this New York trial is one that I think just beggars belief that even the people who are supposed to have been defrauded say we were not defrauded. He paid us all the money back. We do our own due diligence. So yeah, people misstate their personal their personal wealth all the time. Banks know that. That's why banks check out other things. But I mean, they'd always done business with Donald Trump.
The fact that they are regulated in such a way that they have to check it out. And they have to document it very well. They need to have all the CYA paperwork done and ready and available for when they make loans like this. So the banks did their jobs and they got rewarded for it.
Now, so this hangs on an appeal, certainly at the New York State Court of Appeals, and then, if possible, maybe there's a due process violation that you might be able to walk into. Where would you walk? I guess you'd have to go to the Southern District of Manhattan, I guess, in U.S. federal court at the circuit court level to try to put a civil rights case in. I think his best shot here is the New York Court of Appeals. I just don't see how this can possibly, what he did, I don't see how it can be a crime. I mean, unless
I don't either.
Certainly not the crime that's charged. That's the thing. They didn't charge him with, falsifying loan documents, which I don't know if that's a New York crime, but I think there's a federal crime about falsifying loan documents as part of the Consumer Protection Act.
It probably is something like that.
But that's not what they did. They actually went for the fraud and the business fraud angle, which I just don't think that statute is designed
Well, and you
for
know that
that.
one of the primary reasons they did use the state laws was so that he couldn't be pardoned and get off. So they specifically kept it to state claims, and therefore a presidential pardon or whatever wouldn't do any good.
Yeah, so we'll have to see how that goes. I think it would be hilarious if it ended up that Trump never had to pay a dime and this got overturned on appeal. I just think that would be hilarious. Whether the New York Court of Appeals will do that, we don't know. But then that moves us down to Georgia and Fannie Willis, the prosecutor down there, who this past week had a ethics hearing on the fact that the guy she got to help handle the Trump prosecution appears
to lead it.
Yeah, to lead it appears to have been her lover. And she appears to have taken trips with him, and he would use a business card to buy stuff, and she would pay him with cash.
Yeah, apparently she's got a lot of cash sitting around at home.
And one of the things she said was that, well, I do have a lot of cash. Like in my last campaign, I had a lot of cash. I kept some of that. Wait,
what?
Hold on. Did you just admit to violating federal campaign laws?
Oh, yeah, you did. And then a court proceeding.
In a court proceeding during your testimony. And I have to wonder, first of all, I watched some of this testimony. She doesn't strike me as the most competent lawyer. She strikes me as being...
Or dresser.
Yeah. She strikes me as...
She was wearing her dress backwards.
Now, look, I don't know if that's true or not. I do know that there was a zipper down the front of her dress. And I do know enough about women's clothing to know that the zippers are usually in the back. So it's unusual. Let's just put it that way, to have a zipper in the front. So there are a lot of people. There are a lot of people saying she was wearing her dress backwards, which, by the way, would seem to be really hard to do because, the cutout for boobs,
I would think, right,
would be at her shoulder blades, right?
Yeah.
That wouldn't seem to be able to, I mean, you'd seem to think you would know if you had it on backwards. But in any event, she didn't strike me as the most competent lawyer, although she did strike me as one of the most arrogant ones that I've seen in recent memory.
And combative.
And didn't appear to understand whenever the judge had indicated she might be hovering close to being considered a hostile witness.
She didn't even know what that was.
Yeah, she didn't even understand that legal term of art, hostile witness, which changes the way that you, if a witness can be considered hostile, it changes the way that you can question them. You can ask more.
You can ask leading questions. Yeah. So, isn't it correct that you did this, 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 and this? And they're just yes or no questions.
Exactly. So that did not seem to go well for her, although it also seemed like the judge was bending over backwards to help her out as well.
And judges do that. I mean, that's
especially
not that big a deal.
Since most judges are former prosecutors, right?
Well, a lot of them are, yeah.
But I guess the question then becomes, let's say that it's decided that she has broken the Georgia Bar of Ethics, the Georgia Bar's Code of Ethics in this particular prosecution. What are the implications there?
Well, the first one is that she'll be removed from the case altogether. What that does to the case, I'm not exactly sure. Then she's going to have to face ethics charges from the bar, and that might not go very well. She could, in the very least, be suspended. It also, if it's shown that she lied to the court, she could be facing, as well as her lover, Sweet Dig Honeycomb Esquire, whatever it is that Ace calls him. He could be facing these as well. So, yeah, there's some serious implications from the way she's acted and how she's tried to cover it up and stonewall, that creates some serious problems for her personally, as well for the office, the prosecutor's office.
But it's hard to connect the dots between how that affects the Trump case.
It is because I don't. Somebody else would have to take it over, and do they want to? I don't know. This was Fanny's baby, so or Fani. I don't know how you say her name. Um, so I don't know if anybody else has even bought into it. Maybe they are, and maybe they can pick it up with all alacrity. But I'd expect they'd want some delay,
By the way,
and that means a trial's not going to happen before the election.
I can only guess. I haven't checked, but I can only guess how much fun the British press, like the Daily Mail, will have
Oh
with the
my
fact
God.
that her first name is Fanny. Because in England, Fanny means something different.
Yes, it does.
So, does this delay the trial now at this point? I mean, no matter
I
what
think it has
happens,
to.
does it go past the election now?
I think it has to. I don't see how they can get their ducks in a row in time to set a trial date for like this fall would be the closest I think they could come. Um, I don't see that happening.
Okay, then there's the federal case that Jack Smith is overseeing, which,
That's at the Supreme Court right now on interlocutory appeal.
yeah, and Jack Smith's record before the appeals courts, not just the Supreme Court, but appeals courts in general, ain't that great.
Or before any court, quite frankly, he's not exactly a big winner. And
So,
he was the one that tried to take down John Edwards and tried to take down um, our governor, Bob McDonald, and he couldn't win any of those cases.
yeah, so this is so what it looks like we're going to have is these civil cases. Well, the New York case is probably going to languish at the appeals level. I mean, unless the state court of appeals just turns it down, willy nilly. That's going to hang around for another year. So that's going to take us well past the election on that. But that and the E. Jean Carroll case are both civil cases.
Right.
So whatever you might think that they say about Donald Trump, they're civil cases. They have no, other than the amount of money that he has to pay, other than having a judgment imposed against him, they have no practical effect in terms of his criminal liability for anything. So
Right.
you can use them for propaganda purposes, I guess, but other than that, and I'm using propaganda in the broadest term, not in a derogatory term. But other than that, they're meaningless. The only two cases that mean anything are the case in Georgia and Jack Smith's federal case, neither of which looks like we're going to prosecute prior to the election at this point.
Yeah. And then if Trump were to get elected, I would assume they would just all go away, at least for a while. The civil cases would stick around, but there's only so much enforcement that could happen.
Well, the way that the judgment works in the civil case is that he would almost have to pay that immediately. It's it's February. I mean, technically, let's say it was to go against Trump. Now, I don't know what he's going to do with the E. Jean Carroll case, but for the Letitia James case, if he appeals it now, well, it's already February. Does it make it onto the docket even if they're inclined to take it, does it make it
Right.
onto the appeals court docket during this term?
Probably not this term, but I don't know how long their terms are. Typically, there's a break during the summer. So I don't know if they could get it on before the fall. Maybe they could. On an emergency basis or something. I don't know.
Yeah, is it worth an emergency basis appeal because it's a civil trial?
I No, I mean, in order to file the appeal, I'm sure that Trump would have to put up a bond, which may be as much as like half of
Sure.
of what's said to be owed. Um, and with that money parked, there's no real urgency, I don't think, to get the case heard right away.
So, assuming that New York does something similar to what the Supreme Court does, which is they start their term at the second week of October, or the first Tuesday, Monday,
Or sometime, sometime
first
maybe
Monday in
the end
October.
of September or something.
Yeah, I think it's the first Monday in October is the start of each Supreme Court term, whatever date that happens to be. Well, then that implies it's not even going to make it. And if it's a non-emergency, then they're going to hear it. Well, it won't be heard before the election. I mean, the chances are that even if it makes it, because I don't think it makes it onto the docket this term, which means we're not going to hear it until after summer. And then it's just going to be part of, because it is a civil case, part of regular order in the 2024 term, which means they might not even hear the damn thing until.
Oh, it could be November.
Yeah, November, December, January, February. We don't know when it just depends on when it would fall on their schedule. And look, Trump is going to say, we're in the middle of an election. I can't actually show up until after November.
Yeah.
And then we're going to know whether he's president or not on January 20th. And it doesn't moot the case, but whatever the outcome of the case is doesn't really matter now for the next 4 years, because you're going to be really limited in going after him in a judgment. I presume the court would say that, okay, the judgment stands, assuming everything went against him, and presumably the schedule for payment would then be reimposed within 30 days. But he's already put up half of it in bond. So if they did that, they would at least get that half, because he would have to forfeit that bond, right? Even if he was president.
Yeah, and they would also set an interest rate, whatever the judgment interest rate is, that's typically set by statute.
Yeah, and that would just be on the remaining.
The unpaid amounts would be, going forward, gathering interest.
Which you would think he would just want to pay them to get out from under them.
Yeah.
You would think. I wouldn't want to pay the interest on, $150 million.
No.
But, I'm not used to dealing with sums like that, so I'm not sure how you consider the interest at that rarefied level of finance.
Cut off all the zeros.
Yeah. So would I let $135 just hang out there? No, I'd probably, if I had the $135, I'd probably just pay it. Which is, more my speed of judgment and
fines
at my economic level. So it looks like all of the legal, all of the legal jeopardy that he is in terms of criminal sanctions, it looks to me like there's not going to be a determination on either of those made until after the election. So he's going to have to run with those things hanging over his head. But what he's not going to have to run with is a conviction hanging over his head and a conviction appeal hanging over on his head. And then having the American electorate decide, well, we got a guy who's been convicted of a felony who technically can go to jail at some point. Do we want to make him president?
Versus Mushhead.
Yeah. Versus Mushhead. So
unaccountable Mushhead.
And everybody, I think, is going to know that if he does get elected, it doesn't matter. He's not going to go to prison until after he finishes his term anyway, because the president may or may not have immunity.
Well, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, nobody does.
Does that mean like the Secret Service guards are going to have to go to jail with them? Something.
Well,
how would that work?
But that's a question that we wouldn't have to answer until January 21st of 2029, right? Yeah. If he gets elected before being convicted, I think if he were to be convicted, what would that do? What if he does get convicted prior to the election, which of course he'll immediately appeal, right? Mm-hmm. And now he'll have the appeal hanging over his head, but he'll also have a conviction hanging over his head. Part of the problem of living in unprecedented times is that I don't know how to make predictions based on that.
Well, and there's so many moving pieces and ill-defined pieces. It's unprecedented yes, but it's also dealing with laws and concepts that we'd never really had to deal with before, and it really does make everything very confusing. And any little thing changes, a whole different course is set. You know what I mean?
Say what you want about the founding fathers and their brilliance, but you know what they never did when they were writing the Constitution? Put in something about, okay, here's what you do if you happen to elect a guy who's a convicted felon.
Right.
Here's how that's going to work. Because these idiots never considered that someone might possibly be a convicted felon and win the presidency at the same time.
Yeah.
I just don't understand why they didn't have the foresight to just build that into our structure of government.
Those dummies.
Because when you think about it, that's how weird we are. We have a guy that's sitting in the White House who, quite frankly, I'm not sure what shots he's calling, if any.
Well, there's that. Yeah.
Somebody is calling the shots, and they're doing an awfully bad job of it. And Joe Biden's approval rating is down in the 30s. I mean, the last Harvard-Harris poll I think I saw, he is like 5 to 8 points behind Donald Trump in approval in everything. And when you look at things like the border, he is so far behind, it's not even funny. So we have this guy who now is a known quantity. That's Joe Biden's problem, is that people know who he is now, and they know what kind of president he is. Donald Trump's problem is that people know who he is now, and they know what kind of president that he is.
Oh, the thing is, he was actually good at while he was in the White House. At least, discounting his speaking.
Yeah, look, whatever you want to say about Donald Trump, there are two things that he tried to address that nobody has really tried to address for a while. Number one was the border. And number two was the Abraham Accords, which, by the way, is just a solid win. That was a foreign policy victory that no president has had since 1948. So, at least in terms of those two things, and look, unless you're a libertarian and you just hate tariffs so much that their very name means that there's a problem, or their very name invokes hate in you, the fact is his policy of starting to decouple trade with China.
Yeah.
And beginning to impose tariffs on China, and by the way, Joe Biden continued that with his work in ensuring that China could not have access to certain types of microprocessors and electronics technology that they are incapable of building without significant American assistance. It's now been legal. And he forced some chip companies to actually pull out of China completely. So give the devil his due. That's one thing the Biden administration did right. So when you look back at Trump, as awful a human being as he seems to be, and as much as he's unable to control his mouth, you can actually point out to things that he did that were actually big wins in terms of American policy. Whatever you might think about free trade or what have you, the fact is that we should not have free trade with China. The best available evidence is that what we have done is nothing more than build up the Chinese Communist Party, who have funneled a great percentage of the money that we send them, since most of their companies are owned by either the Chinese government or the People's Liberation Army. We have rearmed China with a much more modern military over the past 20 years. And they've done that largely on the basis of trade with the United States. And our policy, which assumed that freer trade with China would lead to greater political reorganization and liberalization in that country, just simply turns out to be wrong. China now sees themselves as our number one primary adversary in the world. It's hard to argue that they are not. Thus, it is hard to argue why we should give them the benefits of full participation in trade with at least the United States.
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
You know, the
Well,
projections,
we
by
approach
the way,
Cuba the same way.
by the way, the projections are now that just with the U.S. Treasury securities that China currently owns, that by 2030 or so, we will be funding interest rates or the interest payments on the Treasury bonds that the Chinese government already owns will largely fund the entirety of the People's Liberation Army's procurement.
Yeah, great. Of course, they're going to have to do something with those dollars.
Yes, well, they are going to have to bring those dollars back home. And
that's not good for us either.
And, well, no, it's not, because now we're having to dump a bunch of dollars into the Forex market to trade for yuan, or renminbi, which means that, okay, the dollar is just going to be worth less in foreign trade, which is really going to harm our ability to export anything. On the other hand, that might revitalize American manufacturing, which is, by the way, starting to come back. People are starting to realize that China is in many ways a problem. And of course, China is also undergoing what appears to be a slow motion economic meltdown anyway.
And they've also got the demographic issue, just as bad, if not worse, than Russia.
Yeah, anything that China is going to do, they need to do now. Which, by the way, is true of Russia. Anything that they're going to do, they need to do now. Because they are not going to have the same reserves of manpower in 10 or 20 years that they have now. Now, for China, it's not that big of a problem, because even having China decline in population by half still gives them a population of 600 million people in 2100.
Yeah.
I mean, say what you want about their technological sophistication, but quantity has a quality all of its own, as Stalin used to say. But China's real estate market is just collapsing. It's been
in a collapse for about a decade now, when they built all those ghost cities and all that stuff.
Yeah, but I think the big thing is just the collapse of Evergrande.
And that's tied into the same thing. Yeah.
Yeah, but with Evergrande gone, their housing market is just collapsed. And since most people have their primary savings in real estate in China, that means that their holdings are worth practically nothing at this point with that collapse. And of course, the quality of the buildings they're building are not worth the money that people have been paying for it. There's a lot of structural problems with the Chinese economy, and if you look at Shanghai or Shenzhen or Beijing, you look at these nice, apparently modern cities, and it's all Potemkin villages, right? Because behind the scenes, and by the way, that's another thing. Tucker Carlson, after that interview, was going around in Russia and saying, "Look at this subway station in Moscow. We don't have anything like this in the United States." Yeah, you don't. You know why? Because Joe Stalin built that subway station to make foreigners think that communism was working great. There were two places in Russia they wanted to look nice, because those are the two places foreigners saw: Moscow and Leningrad, or what we now call St. Petersburg, Petrograd. Outside of that, half of the Russians still have outdoor plumbing. Plumbing would be the incorrect term to use for what they have outdoors. Something like a third of Russian homes are not even electrified. Russia has a population of 150 million people with a GDP less than that of Italy, who have about 59 million people. Russia is a poor country. Every penny that they've had, and this is what the Soviets have done, and clearly this is what the Russian governments have done since then, every penny that they have to make things look nice have gone into Moscow and Petrograd, because that's where foreigners go, and that's the impression that they get of the country. Go 30 miles outside of Moscow, and things get you back to the 19th century pretty quick.
Yeah. Well, China's not really all that different.
Yeah, and China is exactly the same. You go outside of the coastal cities and you get into the interior of China, and it is a poor country largely unelectrified, largely without indoor plumbing, and people are still yoking up oxen to head out into the rice paddies just as they've done for the last 1,000 years. And by the way, China is neither self-sufficient in food or in energy.
That's right.
China's a net importer of both. China can't even feed itself. Which, by the way...
Which is crazy.
Yeah, it's crazy. But by the way, it does make the one-child policy make a lot of sense. All of the, social and cultural negative implications aside, when you can't feed your own population and famine is always hovering around, population control does seem like a pretty good idea.
Well, sure. I mean, the thinking was clear.
Although it does help if you can
complete.
It does help if you can bump off 50 million people at a time with things like the Great Leap Forward, though, or the Cultural Revolution.
That's a good start. Well, yeah, and most of those people are living in starving conditions anyway. So, yeah, it's which we've always known about communist regimes is they're not well run. And even in the Soviet Union, anti-capitalist as it was, and everything taken over by the state, there was still capitalism at the local levels because they just couldn't control everything.
Well,
it wasn't possible.
One of the things that they did in the Soviet Union under Brezhnev is that despite the fact that Stalin had collectivized Soviet agriculture, what they did allow was for people to have private plots. And so you could have up to 1% of if you're a farmer, for example, running a farm collective, your people could have up to 1% of that land to produce privately and sell it privately. And so by the time the Soviet Union collapsed, nearly 50% of the Soviet food production came from that 1% of privatized land.
Right. Tragedy of the commons explained.
Yeah, exactly. And so, there's both Russia and China have a lot of similarities in that they are both undergoing massive depopulation just due to demographic collapse. Russia has the additional problem of life expectancy there for males is still hovering somewhere around 68 years of age, which is really dark compared to the rest of the world, because what that means is a lot of people are dying a lot younger in Russia than they would.
I'm surprised it's that high, to be honest. The rate of alcoholism amongst men is like 80%.
That's why it's in the high 60s rather than the high 70s. They're a decade behind the rest of the world in terms of life expectancy. Russia is self-sufficient in energy, or it could be. Not entirely self-sufficient in food, which, by the way, makes taking over Ukraine of some importance.
Yeah.
Because Ukraine was the bread basket of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
So, again, there's some understandable reasons for why you would want to control Ukraine simply for food production. China doesn't have either of those two options. China has a poor climate and poor land for growing. It has almost no energy resources of its own to speak of. Everything has to be imported. I think what probably, if I was a Chinese global strategic planner, the thing that would keep me up at night would be the fact that Australia could shut off my food and energy supplies alone. Never mind the United States and Great Britain and Japan. Oh my God, we haven't even talked about Japan yet, because now we have a country with 4 aircraft carriers, all of which have very familiar names for those of us who are students of history. That would just keep me up at night with cold sweats if I was a Chinese strategic planner. All you have to do is shut off shipments coming out of the Persian Gulf, and China deindustrializes in 6 months.
Mm-hmm. That'd be kind of fun, actually.
And that's just energy. We haven't even talked about food.
Yeah. And then they go starting wars with India. It's like,
Which, by the way, another reason why China might have an interest in turning a less keen eye towards Russia and their invasion of Ukraine is the fact that China shares a 1,000-mile border with Russia. If they really need food and Russia can produce it and can do so by taking over Ukraine, then that substantially eases China's food problems. I mean, it sure makes Africa's much worse, but it eases China's simply because they now have a supply line for food that can't be interdicted.
Yeah, that's true.
And to a certain extent, a supply line for energy that can't be interdicted.
Right.
So China being friends with Russia makes a lot of sense from a Chinese perspective, where they are both net food and energy importers.
Right. Well, and China still goes and grabs up, gas and oil contracts all around the world, as many as it can. It needs those sources of energy. But don't they make solar panels? Why don't they just put a bunch of those up? Huh. I wonder why not.
Because for about 6 months out of the year, solar panels aren't a very good option in China. Again, we go back to China's climate. China has a horrible climate for agriculture. They have bad land for agriculture. They don't have enough arable land because so much of China is either desert or mountainous, which, by the way, part of the same problem that Russia has, except, trade desert for permafrost and tundra,
right.
And you get you have this huge country that spreads across 9 time zones that really has a very tiny agricultural production area. So just doing the geopolitical strategizing for either of those two countries, food and energy are the top 2 things that you have to get. China is a good catch, or Russia is a good catch for China in terms of an alliance. And by the way, I think a lot of this is what's behind BRICS anyway. So it's interesting to see how this is going to play out in terms of their relationship, because Vladimir Putin said something else in that interview with Tucker Carlson, which was, we have a border with China. It's 1,000 miles long. We've had to learn how to coexist. That's not exactly what's been going on. If by learning how to coexist you mean constant border skirmishes between Soviet and People's Liberation Army units, then yes, you've learned how to coexist, at least in terms of not nuking each other.
Right.
The problem that remains, of course, is that they both have nuclear arsenals. And this last week, I'm just looking at the time. See, when we take 2 weeks off, there's a lot of shit to go through. In the last week, there was this report about a new national security threat, and everybody's been kind of iffy about it because it's all supposed to be classified and whatever. But the gist of it appears to have been the militarization of space, satellites with nuclear weapons that could launch EMP attacks. Certainly both countries have the capability for doing that. And
have had
for both of them for 40 years. In a reasonable world, if this is a credible threat, and by the way, there's no reason why it shouldn't be credible. I mean, as far as technological capabilities, they could both do it. Heck, so could we if we wanted to. There is a UN treaty against the militarization of space.
Yeah. And
you can rely on that as much as you want, I suppose.
Who's going to enforce it?
Yeah, exactly. It seems to me that what a U.S. president should say is very clear, and it would have to be along the lines of Kennedy's position of nuclear missiles in Cuba, which would be that any EMP attack would have to be considered a nuclear attack on the United States, justifying a full and immediate retaliatory response.
Yeah.
What an EMP attack would do. So let's say that about 200 miles overhead, A series of satellites just popped off large nuclear weapons. Now, the damage on the ground obviously would be very minimal. It would be in space. There'd be no shock wave. There would be an initial burst of gamma radiation. But again, if it's 100, 200 miles above the surface of the Earth, that's not something we would worry about that much. The main worry would be every computer, every electrical generating station, every car built since the 1980s. That would all just cease working immediately.
Yeah.
Here's what it wouldn't affect, because they are EMP hardened. It would not affect our intercontinental ballistic missile fleet. It would not affect any of our nuclear submarine fleet, who would be largely, especially those who are not in port at the moment, would be completely immune to it. The EMP would not affect them. Also, a lot of those submarines would presumably be over the Earth's horizon, so the Earth itself would shield them from it. But, most nuclear facilities are down below ground, and having actually lived and worked in a nuclear launch facility, they're pretty hardened against EMP. I mean, the launch facilities for a Minuteman missile are 65, 75 feet underground. And the computer technology, which I won't go into and talk about in any detail whatsoever, let me just tell you that it is largely solid state stuff that is going to be hard to take out with EMP. Right. Those officers in those silos can turn those keys. And those missiles will fly, because the missiles themselves are very well shielded in those silos. I mean, just the blast shield alone on the top of a missile silo is 6 to 7 feet of steel reinforced concrete. They're inside a Faraday cage. EMP is not going to get to them. Our missiles will work. And we still have 10,000 nuclear warheads sitting out there in those missiles, just in, North Dakota, Wyoming, just in the northern tier bases. F.E. Malmstrom, or Francis E. Warren, F.E. Malmstrom, Minot, all of those bases. That's 10,000 nuclear warheads that can go off in a minute. And then, of course, there's the SSBN submarine fleet, which themselves have, a couple of thousand nuclear warheads. We could wipe out the entire planet if we wanted to with a retaliatory response. We could certainly wipe out Russia and China, because they have no defense against those missiles any more than we do against EMP. And so it seemed to me that if this threat is true, that Biden should just say, any EMP attack like that, we will nuke the hell out of any country that we think launched it. And we will destroy your cities. We will destroy all of your military facilities that we can, and we will return you to the Stone Age. And sure, millions of Americans will starve to death because our entire infrastructure will collapse. We'll worry about that in the aftermath. Your worry will be all of your people are dead or dying, either have been burned to a crisp or dying slowly of radiation poisoning as the fallout spreads. And that seems to be the only response that we can make prior to some sort of attack happening, just to put them on notice. And I note that is not the response we're making.
Yeah. Far from it.
The only way to put the kibosh on this is to make it clear that there will be an enormous price that you pay for that.
Yeah, unfortunately, the powers that be are more interested in having Russia in the fold and having China in the fold. Some of that goes to the stupid JCPOA and trying to get a deal with Iran, which the whole concept escapes me as to why that's a good idea. But the rest of it is, I don't think a lot of our leaders are terribly concerned about whether we're involved in a war or not. I think that they are perfectly happy to have wars going on. And, we talked about it earlier. There's some palms that need to be greased, and that's a great way to do it. So having wars going on is not a detriment there. And in fact, it's a benefit when it's not here; it's somewhere else, and we still get to reap the benefits of it. So,
Sure. Again,
I don't see why they would bother.
Well, that's one of the things that it used to be only libertarians that complained about, but increasingly, it's people on the right in general. And oddly, it used to be something the left always complained about, which was getting back to the subject of the military-industrial complex. And if you have a large military-industrial complex and you want to keep them in business, then it seems to me that you have to be able to funnel money to them on a regular basis. And,
war is great for business.
And a peaceful world. Who was it? The Marine Corps general back in the 1920s, Major General Smedley Butler, who basically wrote a book that was titled "War is a Racket." And it's difficult to see how Major General Butler was wrong in any significant respect. If you're going to have to you've got to keep General Dynamics and Raytheon and Martin Marietta and all these other companies alive. You got to keep funneling money to them. And because they're not making anything for the civilian market. They have no fallback. They are largely defense contractors, and that's all they do. Raytheon does a couple of other things, but largely outside of American military missiles for the Department of Defense. That's their business model. How do you keep them alive? And look, I understand the impetus. What happens if, you have this stockpile of missiles, you stop buying anymore, these companies all go out of business, you lose the industrial base to build a modern fifth generation fighter or other military equipment. How do you recap that in case you get into a major World War II style force-on-force conflict? You have the Dwight Eisenhower idea, which was mutual assured destruction. We don't need a conventional army. Piss us off, we'll just nuke you. And that way, we don't need a military-industrial complex. But that does seem like a high-risk strategy.
Yeah, just a bit. You're a one-trick pony.
Your escalation ladder is total peace and global nuclear annihilation. There needs to be a couple of more steps on that escalation ladder, it seems to me. But you don't build those steps if you don't have a military-industrial complex. You don't have tools in your toolbox. One of the reasons why the Europeans are always the first to say, well, let's talk this out. Let's use diplomacy. Well, that's the only tool they have.
Right.
So every problem is a diplomatic problem to the Europeans because God forbid it becomes a military problem. That's one of the reasons why Russia's invasion of Ukraine was such a big wake-up call to many countries in Europe, including a Germany that's run by the socialists, who are saying, oh, when you don't have a military, there may be threats that you can't just... There may be people who don't want to negotiate with you, which has always been true, by the way. I don't know how to square that circle. How do we conduct fifth generation warfare without a military industrial complex? Which means, how does that military industrial complex get funded? How does it exist? And it seems to me that the way that we have decided to make them exist is to be in a constant state of warfare. Because outside of the 1980s, once you get into the 1990s, the 1990s, we've had 2 wars in Iraq, a war in Afghanistan. We managed to run that out. The war in Iraq, we managed to kind of bookend Kuwait and the invasion of Iraq between, 1992 and 2004. We managed to keep Iraq going for about 10 years, Afghanistan for 20. And then when we got out of Afghanistan, In the interim, we had little things going on in Iraq where we could use some stuff. Then we had the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, of Ukraine, which we're not directly involved in, but which has allowed us to shuffle a whole bunch of money to buy stuff. Now, look, a lot of the stuff that we're giving the Ukrainians are stuff that we wouldn't normally use anymore, like Stingers. We haven't built the Block 3 Stinger. We haven't built it since 1991 or 92. It's just sitting around in our inventory. We have way better stuff now. So, okay, we can give them a lot of Stingers. Some things like 155 or 105 millimeter artillery. Okay, you're going to use a lot of those shells, especially America, because everybody talks about how good Russia is with artillery. The Russians are beginners compared to the United States in our use of artillery. But when we use artillery, we use thousands and thousands of rounds of it. We need a big stockpile. But, of course, giving them our current stockpile has now meant that we can now go back to all of the companies that build artillery shells and say, hey, we need a big, big order of artillery shells to refill our stockpiles. And yet, we're $32 trillion in debt. Where's all this money coming from?
Mostly China.
One of the reasons why Great Britain no longer has an empire is because between World War I and World War II, it bankrupted their country.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most people don't realize that the British were still living under wartime rationing into the 1950s because they were so indebted, largely to us, that they simply could not rebuild their economy in the same way that the United States could. And all of these things are so interlinked. You really can't talk about any one of these topics that we've talked about tonight without getting back to how does this affect the country as a whole in terms of our economic well-being and our ability to maintain our position and our wealth. What does an America that's $32 trillion in debt look like when that bill comes due? We've been so rich and so fat for so long. What happens when we have to go back and reimpose rationing?
Right. It won't go well.
And we were talking before the podcast, and I think probably since we're 2 hours into this, we should probably think about ending it at this point. But we've been doing this podcast for a long time. And for most of the time that we've been doing this podcast, it's been kind of a joke with us of let's end how we end the podcast on the most pessimistic note possible, right? So we've always, been pessimistic about stuff. And yet, as much as we fancied ourselves pessimists about how things are going, and by the way, this is a long-term trend. We've been pessimists for 20 years on this podcast. Yeah. Things were never as dark as they are now.
Yeah.
I mean, whenever you look,
you can see it getting worse.
Yeah, we are completely losing social cohesion. And in some part, that also is related to just the sheer amount of immigration that is coming into the country. We don't assimilate people anymore. We don't have either political party doesn't seem like they love this country anymore. One of the interesting outgrowths of this Tucker Carlson Russian interview is seeing how many people on the right are just jumping in Walter Duranty-like about how wonderful Russia is and how much better and what a Christian nation Russia is, like we used to be. When did being America first mean that you like our primary global opponents more than you like America? Whenever you have a lack of patriotism on the left is something we've talked about a long time. We're now seeing that same sort of lack of patriotism on the right. People on the left and the right don't like this country. One of the things we said about Obama was you don't fundamentally change a country you love.
Right.
now it seems like there are a lot of people that want to fundamentally change the country. And look, America's not perfect. There are a lot of things that could and should be changed. But there is a decreasing amount of interest in patriotism towards America, or that I think is damaged even what the idea of America is. Whatever you might say about our actual practices, America, theoretically, America on paper, has much to recommend it. And it seems to me like people on the left and the right no longer believe that. And
a large part of that, I think, is, remember, who was it? John Edwards and his whole thing about two Americas. Well, we scoffed at it then, but it's really become two Americas, and neither one likes the other side.
Yeah, but look, it's dangerous enough when you have two Americas that don't like each other. Now we have two Americas that don't even like the country that they share.
Because they don't share a country. That's what I'm trying to say. We don't share a country. Those of us who don't have a D after our name and are part of the elite ruling classes have a much different country than everybody else. And that's what people see. Biden and Trump are being charged with the same things. Biden's house gets raided. He's threatened with all these criminal sanctions, and Biden, he's just kind of too goofy to really try. It's like, you're not even going to try to sell us on it now.
No,
it was bad enough with Hillary Clinton.
There's this performative policing at the beginning. Right. Oh, look, we're raiding his house. Oh, we have a special prosecutor assigned. We're going to get to the bottom of this. The bottom we get to is, well, yeah, sure, he had a lot of classified stuff. None of it was secured. He was letting people see it. But what are you going to do? I mean, that's essentially what her report was. Sure, yes, he misappropriated classified documents, but what you going to do? Whereas Donald Trump misappropriated classified documents, theoretically, and that's some sort of a problem. So yeah, there's a two-tier justice system. I was talking to somebody a week or two ago. I was talking to him about Russia and Putin, and they said, I don't care about Putin. Why is he any worse than what we have here? That's a fundamental loss of trust in the country in which you live. And if that is true on any sort of widespread basis, then things are about to get dark. As pessimistic as we liked to pretend we were 10 years ago, we are getting into some very dark times now.
Yeah. Well, it's like somebody tweeted, we got Russia and America. The one country is trying to put an opposition oligarch in jail, take away all of his wealth, and leave him to rot in prison. The other one's Russia. Of course, they already put Navalny in jail, and now he's dead. So there are some striking parallels to the way the country's being run. That doesn't mean I think Putin is anything less than a horrible tyrant.
Yeah, the fact that our leadership the fact that our leadership is bad doesn't make Putin or Xi good.
Right. I think they're both equal. Well, not quite equally, but trending towards being equally despotic. Not happy about that. Not going to be happy about that.
And in this country, when we see, as we talked about, the government basically just ignoring the First Amendment, trying to impose censorship, this entire move towards disinformation, even little things, this whole gas stove deal.
Yeah.
No, you can't have gas stoves anymore. Can't be trusted with that. It's going to make Johnny Polar Bear unhappy if we let you cook with gas. So, and also, if you cook with gas, we can't just shut it off the way that we could if you were
If it
cooking
was
with
electric,
electricity, right? So I've been casting around for how do we fix this? And I can't think of any way. And what makes it worse is, I was seeing this YouTube channel that does a lot of alt history stuff, and they had this video that came out this last week about how they expect a civil war to start in 2024. And they could be right. I mean, they do historical analysis as their regular stuff. I don't know that is true, but here's the thing. There are so many bad things that could happen at this point. Things have gone so far off the rails that it's getting me to the point where I'm starting to think, I wish it would just happen. Whatever's going to happen, just happen. Because you know what I can't plan for? I can't plan for 1,000 different contingencies.
Right.
I got to know what the problem is. And I can't plan and have some way of trying to survive or find some sort of modus vivendi to live with all of the 1,000 bad things that can happen. I need the big bad to happen. At least then I know what I'm facing. And at least then I can start making plans. I feel like we're at the cusp of something truly awful, and yet in terms of trying to plan, to figure out how to survive, how to live with it, whatever, what are we going to do? We don't know what that thing is, and so we can't actually do any planning. So we're kind of stuck in this god-awful limbo that I just don't know how to address.
Yeah, I mean, and right now it seems like the biggest spark is coming at the border between Texas and the feds, and then the 25 other states that are backing Texas. So that's half the states, more than half the states.
Yeah, that's the other thing, and we didn't even get into that, and we have to cut this thing off. We're at 2 hours into that, but I mean, you want to talk about something that might be the edge of starting a civil war. We now have states that are actually sending their own National Guard troops out to the border to help support Texas. 25
and
states.
America.
Yeah, 25 states against 25 states, with a federal government who, as far as I can tell, has literally no interest in keeping people from coming across the border. And even this bipartisan border bill would allow basically
almost 2 million.
No, 3 actually, looking at the numbers and multiplying by 365, it comes out to 3 million a year. That is 10% of our population in a decade. All of which are people who, and by the way, we don't know who or why they're coming here. How many of them are coming, we have this national myth that all these people are coming here to be Americans. Is that true?
We know it's not true.
So I don't know where we're headed, but it does seem like we are headed nowhere good. On the plus side, it does seem like we are headed there fast.
Yeah, gradually, then all at once.
Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I think that's about as far as we can take it tonight. And this may be the winning podcast on the most pessimistic ending for the ones that we've had. It's been a years-long struggle, but I think we finally topped ourselves.
Hey, yay. All right, well,
I would
I'll let you guys go.
I would say have a great week, but I can't guarantee.
Have as good a week as you can.
Have as good a week as you can, Michael. Well, hopefully we'll be around to talk next week.
All right,
so
bye.
long. All right, well, that's it. That is the podcast for this week. Thanks for joining us. We always appreciate the fact that you do. We apologize for our 2-week hiatus, but we're now back, and we should be back on our regular schedule, which means we'll plan on talking to you again next week. Until then, so long.